In ancient Rome, everyone believes that slave owners could do absolutely anything they wanted with their slaves. That's what most people imagine. But the truth hidden in ancient records and loopholes in Roman law is more complex and surprising. Yes, slaves were officially property. They were treated as things, not as people. Legally, they ranked below even domestic animals. They couldn't marry, couldn't testify in court, and didn't have families recognized by the state. A slave was born without a legal name. They were the human equivalent of a tool. Useful, replaceable, disposable. And their owners, considered absolute masters. Many believed that these Roman masters held the power of life and death in their hands. Literally, if they wanted to strangle a slave at breakfast and hire another by lunch, nothing stopped them. What almost no one tells you is that, even in a brutal society like Rome, some limits started to emerge. But why? The answer is a complex mosaic. And what comes next may completely change the way you view the power of Roman masters, and especially the boundaries they themselves couldn't cross. Get ready, because we're about to reveal the limits of the Roman Empire. To understand how it all began, we need to go even further back, to the turbulent days of the Roman Republic, a period glorified in history books, full of Senate speeches, wars of conquest, and legendary victories. But for slaves, it was an unrestrained hell. During this early phase, there were simply no laws preventing a master from abusing, mutilating, or killing a slave. None. Roman law was clear and brutal. A slave was an extension of the owner's property, like his house, his horse, his silver vase. Now here's a detail that few know. Roman censors, prestigious figures tasked with guarding morality and customs, could, in theory, punish masters for acts of extreme cruelty. But there's a big catch. These censors weren't required to investigate anything. They only acted if there was a formal accusation. And guess what? Only free citizens could make such accusations. Slaves had no voice, no legal presence. They were living ghosts within the Republican machine. And even among the free, who would dare to accuse a powerful Roman patrician of mistreating a slave? That was asking to be politically crushed, or worse. On top of that, censors were highly temporary figures, elected every 5 years with terms of only 18 months. A very short time to deal with the tens of thousands of issues in Roman society, and of course, protecting slaves was never at the top of the list. Want an even more shocking fact? In over 4 centuries of the Republic, there isn't a single concrete record of censors punishing a master for cruelty against slaves. Not one. That says it all. But the Republic fell. And with it, the illusion that masters were above everything and everyone also collapsed. With the rise of the emperors, Rome ceased to be governed by Senate debates and came under the command of a single man's will. And that man, the emperor, also came to hold the moral authority once wielded by the censors. It was then that, for the first time, direct interventions began to appear against abuses committed by slave owners. Rare, yes, but real. And each one carried immense symbolic weight. A famous example is Augustus, the first emperor of Rome, the very founder of the empire. Seen as a symbol of order and virtue, on one occasion, he learned that a master was planning to execute his slave in an especially cruel way, in front of others, as an exemplary punishment. The case reached the emperor's ears because it sparked outrage among those present. The violence was so extreme, so blatant, that not even the bloody regime of the early empire could ignore it. Augustus then personally intervened, stopped the execution, and punished the owner. Not because he loved slaves, but because the spectacle of cruelty threatened the public image of Roman order. Decades later, another emperor would take a stand. Hadrian, famous for his intellect and interest in Greek culture. Hadrian also got involved in a peculiar case. A Roman lady was constantly beating her slave girl with brutal force. Once again, the case drew public attention. And once again, the emperor decided to act. Hadrian reprimanded and punished the woman, declaring that even owners had limits on how they could treat their human property. But understand this. These cases were so rare that they entered history precisely because they were glaring exceptions. The vast majority of abuses remained in the dark, without powerful witnesses, without public outcry, without an emperor to intervene. It was around the 1st century AD that the first official, though still timid, attempts emerged to establish written rules to curb the most grotesque excesses of masters. One such measure came with the so-called Lex Petronia, enacted in 61 AD. It stated the following: no slave could be thrown into combat against wild beasts in amphitheaters or arenas without prior authorization from a magistrate. Does it seem like little? Yes. But for the slave who, until then, could be handed over to the claws of a panther or a lion just to entertain guests during a banquet, this was a wall between life and death, and the Lex Petronia was not an isolated case. During the reign of Emperor Claudius, new rulings began to draw even clearer boundaries. Masters who abandoned their sick slaves, in the streets, in the woods, as if they were trash, legally lost their rights over them. If the slave managed to survive on their own, they automatically gained freedom. No need for the former owner's permission, no trial, just staying alive was enough. It was a symbolic and profound blow. The message was clear. A master who discarded their property lost the right to it, and Claudius went further. He ruled that masters had to pay for and provide burial for their dead slaves, something unprecedented. Until then, many bodies were simply dumped into pits or burned without any ceremony. It may seem like little, but for a society that considered slaves as talking things, this was a deeply symbolic shift. It was the seed of a dangerous idea, that a slave had some value beyond the economic. As the decades passed, the empire realized that unchecked cruelty weakened Rome, and so restrictions began to reach territories once considered sacred to the owners. The slave's body and life. Under the reign of the ruthless Domitian, a measure few expected emerged: the prohibition of slave castration, a brutal practice that was common, especially among the wealthy, to turn boys into eunuchs and ensure they posed no sexual threat in patrician households. This ban was reinforced by Hadrian, decades later. He understood that such extreme practices destabilized the empire's moral and social order. Rome had to appear civilized, even if only on the surface. But the true rupture came with Antoninus Pius in 161 AD. He did what no emperor before had dared. He banned the unjustified killing of slaves by their own masters. That's right. From then on, killing one's own slave was no longer an absolute right. If the death was considered unjust, without legal cause, without a crime committed by the slave, the master could be prosecuted as if he had killed someone else's slave. It was a direct blow to the heart of the concept of total ownership. Roman law still didn't recognize slaves as full persons, but their lives could no longer be taken with impunity. Extreme violence, gratuitous execution, impulsive murder, all of that began, albeit slowly, to become a crime. Imagine the impact of that on the aristocrats. For centuries, they had been raised to see their slaves as things, like cattle. And now, for the first time, the state was putting a brake on the hand that whipped, punished, and killed. Of course, these laws didn't eliminate the suffering of slaves. Most still lived in inhumane conditions. But each restriction, each limit, opened a crack in the facade of the master's absolute power. And it was precisely through those cracks that a new vision began to emerge, a dangerous and previously unthinkable concept. That the life of a slave, though subjugated, had legal value comparable to that of a free citizen. This shift became clearer under the rule of Constantine, in the early 4th century, the first Roman emperor to embrace Christianity. He inherited a divided, restless empire and desperately needed to organize violence to maintain order. In 319 AD, he enacted one of the most impactful laws in the history of Roman slavery. From that moment on, deliberately killing a slave would be treated the same as killing a free man. The slave, even without citizenship, now had a life legally recognized as inviolable. But this protection didn't extend to all forms of death. If the slave died during a physical punishment considered normal, nothing would happen. Violence within traditional limits was still tolerated, expected even. It was a thin line between permitted punishment and forbidden execution. Even so, this new law marked a radical shift in legal discourse. For the first time, the state not only acknowledged the slave's existence, but also began punishing those who treated them as disposable. And Constantine didn't stop there. In another historic decision, he banned forcing enslaved women into prostitution. More than that, if a slave woman was forced to prostitute herself, in a brothel, at home, or by direct order of her master, she would automatically gain her freedom. No trial, no debate. The mere existence of sexual violence broke the ownership contract. And this measure wasn't limited to one city or province. It was standardized and applied across the entire empire. Gradually, the boundaries ceased to be merely moral or symbolic. They became legal, concrete, written into law. But as much as these laws represented remarkable progress for the time, it was impossible to ignore what remained behind every clause, every decree, every gesture of protection. The system remained fundamentally violent. What the Roman state sought above all was to preserve order, to avoid revolts, to prevent scandals, to ensure that explicit cruelty wouldn't delegitimize the master's authority or threaten peace in the streets. Some loopholes opened, some rules were imposed, but the essence of the system remained intact. The slave was still a legalized tool of labor, control, and exploitation. Now I want to know your opinion. Which of these laws surprised you the most? Do you think these laws were a real step forward, or just an elegant way to preserve slavery? Leave your answer in the comments. And if you like this story and want to see more epic content like this, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. In the video appearing on your screen, we'll reveal what happened to a soldier who returned from battle severely wounded.